Greetings and welcome back to CS195 Web Development Week 3 Intro to CSS. Our lesson for now is selecting by ID. This lesson should be a little bit shorter than our last lesson because we don't have to go over the basics of it. We're just going to now, in the next couple lessons, just show you how to select a little bit more specifically. Now, that being said, how do we select in the first place? Let's look at some review. Last lesson we learned how to add colors to tags, but that applied to all tags. It was not very specific, which is where we're going to learn today, but still, how do you change the font color, right? So if you remember our nice little piece right here, we have the selector. This does the whole body, but it could be any, the paragraph tag, the H1 tag, the squiggly bracket. You change it with a declaration. You change it with a declaration, which has a property, and this is how you change font color. The font color property is just color, colon, and then a value. I believe this is none of the colors, which means black. So this should be black. But this is hexadecimal. That's where we kind of mentioned that last time. Hashtag is that. But this is what you're looking at for how you change it. You need to have all of this for your rule in order to, but this is particular how you do this declaration. Again, pretty much as we go through down here, you're going to learn a bunch of different declarations. We're focusing now on how to select. So the selector is going to be our first 3 lessons, and then declarations are going to be the rest of them. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about today's lesson. We're going to understand how to use an ID to change the style of your HTML. Bottom line is we're going to learn how to select by ID. So therefore, our student success criteria is students will demonstrate adding an ID, because this is an important piece of it, and this is something we'll talk about in a little bit, to an element, then selecting that element by its ID, and changing a style property in the style tag. Any style, doesn't matter. The key is we have a couple pieces to this. We can't just go and select the ID like we did in this one, right? We can't just type in a selector. There's more pieces to it. So we'll watch a video real quick on how to do this, and again, we'll talk about it. The video is going to be a little bit shorter because, just a little bit shorter on this, there is the added aspect of how does an ID work. We've talked about attributes, and we know how to select and change. So a lot of this just is kind of tying the 2 pieces together. So watch this video and figure out how to do this.
In this web page, we're using CSS to style our H2s and paragraphs so that all of the H2s are green and all of the paragraphs are purple. But what if we wanted to select just the first H2 or style just the second paragraph? We'd need to come up with a way to tell the browser exactly which of the elements we're selecting so that it didn't apply the styles to all of them like it is now. One way to do that is to select by ID. We can give a tag in our page a unique ID, and then we can tell CSS, listen here, I only want to apply these styles to the element with this ID, not to any of the other elements. To do that, the first step is actually modifying the HTML to add ID attributes to the tags we want to specifically select. Let's start with the second paragraph here. To add an ID attribute, we put our cursor in the start P tag, right after the P, then add a space, and then type ID equals quotes.
All right, so there's a good review. Remember, it's attribute equals quotes. Attributes go inside of that first tag. So here's the opening tag, here's the closing tag. All of this is this paragraph. So by adding this ID, everything inside of the paragraph is going to get things. But now, this being said, adding this ID by itself does nothing. Again, it's just part of the prep that we need to do in order to do this. Also, hopefully you figured out that this little bunny foo-foo is going to be this paragraph. So when we add CSS rule, it'll change this paragraph. But again, attribute equals quotes. It's inside of that first tag. There is a space here, and the ID attribute is just ID.
Now we need to fill in this ID attribute with a value. What ID should I give it? Well, it should be descriptive and unique. Nothing else on this page should ever have the same ID. Well, since this is a song about rabbits, I'll call it rabbits-song.
All right, so what she pointed out is very important, and this is why all this works. Is an ID is one. We mentioned that. How do you select just one item? So with that being said, never ever give two different items the same ID. It's not necessarily a hard concept to remember if you just think about how many people in the school district in a job site, how many people have the same ID? None, right? All of the students around you have your own student ID. When you go to work for a company, they're going to probably give you an ID, and it's going to be different than everyone else's because it's unique. There's only one of them, so therefore, same concept. Don't go up here and give this an ID of Rabbit Song. The whole point of an ID is to select one item at a time. Now, I can give this an ID, but I'm going to call it Rabbit Songs 2 or something, right? You're going to give it just a different ID, because our next lesson we're going over is what can I use to give a bunch of them. But remember, ID is just one.
We can't have spaces in IDs, so if they have multiple words like this one, you should always use hyphens or underscores. I really like hyphens myself. Now we have a way of identifying this paragraph uniquely, so we can add a CSS rule targeting it. Let's go back up to our style tag for the second step. We'll add a new line after the last rule there. And now remember, the first part of CSS rule is the selector, the part that tells the browser what to select. In our previous rules here, we use selectors like H2 and P to select all of the H2 and P's on the page. Now, to make a selector that only selects elements with a particular ID, we must start the selector with a hash sign. That tells the browser that whatever is coming next is an ID.
All right, so what do you use to start off an ID selector? Always the hashtag, the sharp sign, the hash, the tic-tac-toe sign, whatever you want to call it. This is what you use to start it off every single time. And when we go to class later, there's something else. But notice the first one we used did not. Right? If you are selecting it by its actual tag, you just type the tag. You just type the tag. I see a lot of the time students will put a hashtag in front of this. Hashtag means ID. It's telling the computer that I'm giving you an ID. If you just type it, it's going to be the H2. So the hashtag is going to be the ID. And then how do I know what the ID is? Well, she just typed it, right? So that is the ID of it. Notice it went blue. It's recognizing that, right? So again, this is really important to understand that hashtag is for ID. Hashtag is for ID. And then again, you're going to put whatever your ID. I get this all the time, especially when you're trying to follow along, or a lot of times I like to have you build your own, and I'll be like, you'll put something like my ID, and then when we're coming up here, I'll be like, all right, so how do you do ID? And then this ID. And you're like, it doesn't work. I'm like, well, it's because you used my ID, and I was just using an example. I don't know. Everyone has a different ID, but you need to put whatever your ID is. So this is a really important. Whatever the ID is you want to change, this needs to match this.
Now we write our ID, rabbits-song. The rest of the rule is the same as before. We open and close our curly braces, we add a property like background color, and ta-da! It worked. Only the song paragraph has the yellow background color and the first paragraph stayed the same. Let's do this again for selecting this first H2. Can you remember the first step? That's right, we need to actually modify this HTML to add the ID attribute. So we stick our cursor in the start tag, add a space, type ID equals, and then type a very unique and descriptive ID. So rabbits-info-heading. Okay, the second step, back up in our style tag. We add a new line, write the hash sign, then our ID, rabbits-info-heading, and then put our properties inside curly braces. Background.
All right, before she get this, I want to take a quick heads up. Do we think this is going to work? When she types in background color, do we think this is going to work? All right, say yes or no. All the yeses, all the no's. All right, let's think about this.
Color purple. Uh-oh. Okay, it didn't work. Do you see what?
And again, this is this H2 right here. This should have a background of purple, but it doesn't, right? So we were right. So, but most of you probably just raised your hand or said yes because it sounded like a leading question, so I probably was going to be yes. But what is wrong? What is wrong? So go ahead, say it out loud, think about it. What is wrong? Why did this not select this? And it's because, and the answer is because this. So again, she's going to go over this real quick for you, but the answer is because of this, capital H. So hopefully that's what you got. Let's see.
Went wrong? Did I spell it the same way? Rabbits info heading, rabbits info heading. So they look pretty much the same. Now I could compare them letter by letter to figure out what's wrong, but what I like to do is just go down and select the ID in the HTML and copy it and then paste it in here to make sure it's exactly the same. And it worked. My H2 has a background. Now, did you notice what changed? Maybe you did. It was the H here. The H used to be a capital H, which the browser does not consider the same. It has to be that lower h to match the HTML. That's because IDs are case sensitive, so you have to both spell them and case them the same way everywhere. I find it's best to just always use lowercase for every letter in my IDs, so I don't have to think about what casing I used when. Okay, now let me leave you with one last warning. IDs must be unique. If you have two tags on your page with the same exact ID, the browser might style both of them, but it also might style only one of them, and you don't want to leave that up to chance.
So let's go ahead and try this out together. Again, there's not a lot more to this. We did add having the attribute, but in this case, the big piece is, it's still the rule's a rule. We just have this. Now, I already have an ID here. So let's tab, 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 get over so we're online. And then, again, remember, what'd you say you do to select an ID? What symbol? Pause, think, type, talk. You guys got to think about this. Hashtag, right? Hashtag is it. And then, again, it's whatever the ID is. All right, that's important to understand. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to kind of do this all by yourself, but in this case, change me, squiggly bracket, enter. Now, notice that there's two H1s, right? We selected both the H1s. This one selects only the second one. So when we do this, it should only change the second one. Now this is indented too far, so I'll fix that because it's bugging me. And let's go ahead and do the background color. Background, and you can do dash color. Notice it turns purple. Got my colon. Automatically ends with a semicolon. So again, I know I did this right. And let's do red. Probably can't read it very well, but you can see it. So right away, it only did this one. That the ID allows us to select just one. Now, what I want you to do though, I want you to give the first H1 an ID, and then I want you to go ahead and change it as well. All right, so go ahead, pause the video. I'm going to keep going, so just pause the video now, give this an ID, and then change it. All right, so hopefully you actually paused it and did this by yourself, but again, inside of that first ID, or first tag, we're going to do ID equals quotes, right? Attribute equals quotes, ID equals quotes. And then we're just going to do change this, and we're going to go up here, same rules, hashtag change this. Now, if you got this far and didn't get here, this is what I'm talking about, where if you have something different than change this, don't try and change this here. I see this quite a lot. Students will start typing this, and then they'll have this done, and they'll jump back up, and they'll type whatever I type, but it doesn't matter. This needs to match this. And again, you can see when I highlight this, it puts a little square around this. So you know that it matched. Now we can get this on a background. Background pink. And there we go. We saw that it worked. So that's ID. The big thing is you have to actually identify this. Now, when you go to the challenge, they'll probably be like this. You'll already have an ID here, so you have to go down and figure out what it is, and then come back up here and create the rule. So the selector, and then the descriptor, right? What are you changing? The property and the value. So with that, let's go ahead and do that practice and challenge. Just realize that some of it might be done. Read the directions, do the journal entry, and we'll see you next lesson.